acompanha um pouquinho a Itaúsa, no último evento que a gente faz anualmente com investidores, a gente anunciou a evolução da estratégia ESG Itaúsa, onde a gente repensou sobre a estratégia, junto com a alta liderança, através de vários workshops, com a intenção de avaliar onde que a gente poderia potencializar essa agenda, reconhecendo que nós, né, Itaúsa, sendo a maior holding de capital aberto do Brasil, tínhamos um potencial de contribuir ainda mais com essa agenda. Então, nesse contexto, a gente definiu três grandes pilares de impacto positivo que a gente poderia causar. O primeiro grande impacto que a gente vem trabalhando desde então é o impacto através da holding. Isso significa, né, que a gente vai avançar nas estratégias sociais e ambientais pela holding. O primeiro grande anúncio que a gente fez foi a criação do nosso Instituto Itaúsa, que já está aí a todo vapor, junto com o Marcelo, liderando essa agenda e essa implementação, que visa promover, né, a questão do meio ambiente, da preservação do meio ambiente e também aumentar a produtividade brasileira. Então, a gente entendeu que eram dois grandes temas bastante importantes e esse instituto vai atuar com projetos, né, voltados a essas duas grandes agendas. Provavelmente, no próximo evento para investidores, a gente já vai ter grandes novidades a respeito desse tema para compartilhar aí com vocês. E ainda nesse primeiro pilar de impacto, através da holding, anunciamos também que a gente vai buscar a neutralidade de carbono pela holding e avançar em todas as agendas aí relacionadas à diversidade e inclusão. Acho que o segundo grande pilar de impacto, e que tem muito a ver com o core business da Itaúsa, é como a gente atua em relação às nossas investidas, né? Vocês sabem que a gente tem um portfólio de investimento em setores muito relevantes do país, e a gente aqui, sim, tem o poder de influenciar e potencializar ainda mais essa agenda ESG nas nossas investidas. Então, aqui a ideia é como potencializar essa agenda, fortalecendo ali também todos os aspectos de governança. Acho que governança sempre foi um tema bastante prioritário de aporte da Itaúsa às nossas investidas, mas não somente isso, vamos priorizar também outras agendas, como, por exemplo, a busca por neutralidade de carbono e também toda a agenda relacionada à diversidade e inclusão nas nossas investidas por meio dos nossos representantes. Vocês sabem que a gente tem representantes lá em todas nas nossas investidas, em conselhos de administração e também em fóruns onde se discute sustentabilidade. Então, aqui a gente acha que temos um papel importante de impulsionar ainda mais essa agenda aqui nas nossas investidas. E também falando em portfólio, acho que o outro grande foco é como a gente vai estruturar de uma forma ainda mais organizada e com amplas discussões internamente o tema de sustentabilidade dentro da escolha de novos negócios, novos investimentos. Então, acho que essa é uma outra grande agenda aqui que tem relação com esse segundo pilar de impacto por meio aqui do nosso portfólio, tá? E acho que falando aqui do terceiro pilar, e que é a base de tudo, né, senão a gente não consegue avançar nessa agenda de forma genuína, é através da governança. A governança sempre foi, Itaúsa acho que sempre foi uma grande referência em governança, e a gente vem avançando, né, ano após ano. Acabamos de implementar aí o nosso comitê de auditoria, 100% formado com membros independentes. Já temos hoje 4 membros independentes no nosso conselho de administração. Esses membros independentes lideram todos os comitês que assessoram, né, o conselho de administração hoje. Já temos 2 mulheres, né, fazendo parte do nosso conselho de administração. Aliás, mulheres fazem parte aí da maioria, né, da liderança da Itaúsa. Então, muito nos orgulha, né, o avanço que a gente tem tido aí nessa agenda. E falando ainda em governança, a gente implementou, então, a área de inteligência de sustentabilidade na holding. Trouxemos o Marcelo Furtado, que é um grande conhecedor aí de toda a agenda social e ambiental. Então, ele que tem liderado essa área, está também responsável pelo nosso Instituto Itaúsa e pela implementação dessa nova agenda ESG. E muita coisa já tem sido feita, depois, Marcelo, pode falar de avanços dessa agenda, que faz menos de um ano aí que a gente divulgou, né, qual que seria essa nova estratégia, e muita coisa já tem acontecido desde então. Acho que um outro ponto bastante importante é o aumento de disclosure de métricas ESG. Divulgamos recentemente o nosso relato integrado, já incorporando uma série de novas métricas ESG e seguindo aí os principais frameworks, né, de divulgação do mercado. Então, esse é um avanço contínuo e que a gente está bastante comprometido também com essa agenda. E acho que um outro ponto importante, a partir desse ano, grande parte da liderança já tem metas ESG impactando remuneração de curto prazo e de longo prazo. Então, acho que esse é um outro avanço bastante importante e que demonstra o quão a holding, né, está bastante comprometida com essa agenda. Bom, e acho que, para finalizar aqui, como a gente definiu o posicionamento ESG da Itaúsa, depois de repensar essa agenda, chegamos aqui à conclusão que a Itaúsa é uma empresa que vai buscar sempre investir com muita responsabilidade e atuar como agente de mudanças na construção de negócios, visando o impacto para o desenvolvimento sustentável do Brasil. Então, acho que essa agenda diz muito, né, sobre o que queremos ser, e acho que esse evento também conversa muito com a estratégia ESG da Itaúsa, visando contribuir com a capacitação, não somente, né, dos colaboradores aqui internos da Itaúsa, mas também contribuindo com outros agentes de mercado nessa agenda de ser um agente de transformação e colaborar com o setor como um todo para a gente seguir junto, avançando nessa jornada ESG. Bom, e hoje a gente tem o prazer de receber aqui Tony Goldner, da Força-Tarefa Relacionada à Natureza, TNFD, e o Simon Zadek, da Nature Finance, que gentilmente aceitaram o nosso convite para estar aqui hoje e vão participar de um bate-papo que vai ser moderado pelo Marcelo e vão poder contribuir bastante aqui com todo o conhecimento e expertise que eles têm no tema. Com certeza vai ser uma agenda bastante interessante, bastante produtiva e muito inspiradora, espero, aqui para todos vocês. Então, que vocês aproveitem bastante o evento. Queria só comentar que o evento conta aí com tradução simultânea, inglês e português. Para quem está aqui presente, tem, né, o equipamento, pode acompanhar pelo equipamento, e para quem está nos acompanhando online, também pode usar aí a opção de tradução que está disponível na barra de ferramentas do Zoom para acessar a tradução simultânea. Também a gente vai ter espaço para perguntas ao longo aí do evento. Então, quem está acessando online pelo Zoom pode mandar suas perguntas pelo próprio chat aí do Zoom, que a gente vai acompanhar e vai transmitir aqui para os nossos convidados. E quem estiver aqui no auditório acompanhando, é só levantar as mãos aí que a gente passa o microfone e vocês podem interagir aqui com os nossos convidados. Bom, agora eu queria convidar a Marina Grossi. O Ricardo, tá bom. O Ricardo, que é o membro aqui do Conselho Empresarial Brasileiro para o Desenvolvimento Sustentável, e que vai fazer aqui uma fala de abertura também do nosso evento e contribuir aqui para esse início aqui do nosso bate-papo com os nossos convidados. Então, seja bem-vindo, Marcelo. Obrigada, o palco é todo seu. E bom evento para todos vocês. Obrigada de novo pela participação.
Alô. Bom dia a todas e todos. Eu sou o Ricardo Mastrotti, diretor executivo do CBEDS. A Marina e boa parte do nosso time está em Belém, que hoje é um dia onde tem bastante coisa acontecendo lá na cúpula, né? Então, eu queria falar brevemente para vocês, começar falando um pouquinho do CBEDS. Então, o CBEDS é o Conselho Empresarial Brasileiro para o Desenvolvimento Sustentável. A gente completa 26 anos esse ano, né? Então, é uma iniciativa de grandes empresários, né, que montaram esse conselho. Então, para falar sobre um único tema, que é o desenvolvimento sustentável. Por isso que tem esse DS no nome. Faz 26 anos que a gente está nessa agenda. Então, hoje a gente tem algo em torno de 110 empresas, a maioria grandes empresas, né, representando aí em torno de 50% do PIB, e todos os setores aqui representados. Então, não é só indústria, tem indústria, agro, serviços, serviço financeiro, enfim. O foco do trabalho do CBEDS eu dividiria perdão, em 2 pontos. Então, tem a questão de capacitação dessas empresas, então, discussões de temas como esse, que hoje é o foco aqui, né, de biodiversidade, e também influência, né, a advocacy em políticas públicas, como é que a gente torna o arcabouço aí, jurídico nosso do Brasil mais favorável para essas agendas de desenvolvimento sustentável, né? Então, alguns exemplos, a gente esteve presente na COP15, né, do ano passado, que foi a COP de biodiversidade, em Montreal, no Canadá, e ali a gente conseguiu mobilizar a maior delegação privada, né, que o Brasil já teve numa COP. A gente tinha mais de 40 pessoas, 15 empresas, e foi ali que foi aprovado o Marco Global de Biodiversidade, né? Então, acho que foi um evento de extrema importância, né? A gente sempre consegue fazer paralelos aqui entre a trajetória toda de clima e as COPs de clima, que todo mundo acompanha, né? Então, vamos sediar uma COP, a COP 30 em 2025, mas é uma jornada longa, e a COP de Bio a gente sente que ela está avançando agora rapidamente, a partir principalmente da aprovação desse marco global, e a trajetória vai ser muito mais rápida do que todos esses passos que a gente deu para clima, né? Então, se o desafio era grande em clima, como medir clima, né? E a gente chegou a uma régua, né? Uma métrica. Então, a gente tem carbono equivalente, a gente tem... E o desafio, quando em biodiversidade, é muito maior, né? Como medir impactos e dependências de biodiversidade, né? E aí, o setor financeiro, né, tem um grande... Acho que a sociedade como um todo passa por um grande desafio, né? Primeiro que a gente está no momento de uma tríplice emergência, né? Então, a gente tem uma emergência climática, a gente tem uma questão de desigualdade social que é crescente, né? E a gente tem a questão de perda de biodiversidade. E acho que o grande desafio nosso como sociedade é como é que a gente consegue redirecionar recursos que hoje vão para ações, né, que de alguma forma impactam negativamente a natureza, né, consomem recursos e de forma não sustentável, e aumentam ainda mais essa injustiça social, a má distribuição de renda. Então, acho que esse é o grande desafio nosso como sociedade, e o CBEDS, a ideia é qual é a contribuição que a gente vai dar nesse sentido. Então, hoje, para a biodiversidade, acho que o maior desafio é esse, entender, né? Então, a gente vai ter aqui o TNFD, né? O CBEDS é a organização que organiza a consulta para o TNFD, para avançar, que é justamente como medir, como reportar, né, algo que não é trivial, que é o caso da biodiversidade. Então, só para dar alguns números em relação à biodiversidade, a biodiversidade foi considerada o 4º maior risco, segundo o Fórum Econômico Mundial, né? Nós estamos falando aí que 50% do PIB mundial está moderada ou altamente dependente de recursos naturais, né? Então, 44 trilhões de dólares. Então, esse é o tamanho do desafio. E, como eu disse, a métrica não é tão linear, tão facilmente... É difícil de definir e de medir e reportar, né? Então, o CBEDS tem várias ações, né? Eu gostaria de falar algumas delas aqui. Então, o interesse do nosso setor, né, do setor empresarial, é avançar, e é avançar rapidamente. Então, tivemos oportunidade de entregar para a ministra Marina Silva, no Dia Mundial da Biodiversidade, em maio, um documento justamente colocando o setor à disposição e sublinhando esse interesse nosso de estar avançando de maneira rápida, porque o Brasil também passa por um momento muito favorável, né? Então, a gente vai ter estamos tendo a cúpula da Amazônia nesse momento. O ano que vem a gente tem G20, em 2025 a gente tem a COP30 e tem até a possibilidade, a COP de biodiversidade, que seria na Turquia, está sendo discutido onde vai ser, né? Quem sabe a gente consegue trazer para cá também. Mas, enfim, o CBEDS tem atuado em várias frentes. Então, eu gostaria de destacar para a biodiversidade pelo menos 2 ações que a gente fez na COP. Então, na COP a gente lançou a plataforma Ação pela Natureza, que é justamente esse convite a um aprendizado coletivo, né? Esse desafio de como medir, como reportar impactos e dependências é um desafio global. Então, acho que aprender junto vai ser mais rápido, vai ser mais eficiente. Essa é uma das linhas de atuação do CBEDS. E lá também, ainda na COP15, a gente teve a oportunidade de lançar um documento que é o maior inventário de ações em biodiversidade, né, de empresas. Então, ali a gente, ao colocar todo esse conhecimento junto, a ideia também é essa de como é que a gente avança nesse caminho que não é um caminho nada fácil aqui para a gente, né? É um caminho de muito aprendizado. Outro ponto que eu gostaria de ressaltar é que depois, quando a gente voltou da COP15, né, então estava aprovado o marco global e agora o desafio
Framework
é
had
esse,
been
né? Como que nós
approved, and
vamos
then the challenge that came up.
implementar, né? E então a gente está muito próximo do governo federal, né? A gente está participando ali fortemente na discussão da EPAMB, né? Então é justamente como colocar em prática esse marco global. E a gente já teve várias reuniões com o Ministério e a gente está se colocando como o representante do setor empresarial ali, então consolidando essas contribuições, porque a gente entende que o melhor é que quando saia para a rua, a coisa tem que sair alinhada, a coisa tem que ser aplicável, a coisa tem que ser implementável, né? Então, acho que esse é um pouco do nosso desafio. EPAMB é a sigla, então, para a Estratégia Nacional de Promoção da Biodiversidade. Esse é o documento que a gente está desenvolvendo junto com o Ministério do Meio Ambiente, né? E eu estava comentando ali fora com o Simon sobre falando ainda do momento brasileiro, né? O Ministério da Fazenda está colocando um pacote verde, o que eles chamam de pacote verde, né? Então, é uma costura, a gente vê já nesse governo vários ministérios mobilizados, né? Só para citar um exemplo, a agenda climática está em 17 ministérios, mas esta costura é um momento muito favorável, né? Então, as contribuições do setor empresarial através do pacote verde, a gente vê como um canal realmente importante. Então, a gente está à frente ali, organizando essas contribuições. E, certamente, biodiversidade é um tema-chave, né? Por quê? O Brasil é um país de maior biodiversidade do planeta, nós temos as maiores florestas, e eu acho que está aí essa janela de oportunidade, é uma janela curta, né? Eu estava falando dos eventos internacionais, tem uma questão de interesse do governo em promover essa agenda, mas considerando que a gente tem os maiores assets ambientais do mundo e também uma das maiores desigualdades sociais do mundo, aí essa janela de oportunidade de como é que a gente vai conseguir redirecionar o fluxo de capital, ter novas atuações de formas diferentes, utilizando esse asset ambiental para diminuir as desigualdades sociais, a injustiça social que a gente tem nesse país. Então, essa é a grande oportunidade, né? Eu vou aqui encerrar minha fala só comentando que nós somos o ponto focal para consulta da TNFD no Brasil, e esse é um dos trabalhos que também nos dá muito orgulho, porque a gente entende que a importância de ter essas regras claras, né? O setor empresarial precisa dessa segurança jurídica, precisa entender a regra do jogo, né? A vontade de atuar está clara, né? A gente está Temos aqui hoje o presidente do conselho do CEBEDES, Denise, conselheira consultiva do CEBEDES, e eu e eles podemos atestar que o interesse do setor produtivo é esse, né? A gente entregou documentos para a Marina Silva, para o ministro Haddad, justamente nos colocando à disposição e buscando essa articulação, porque vai precisar de muita articulação. Estou falando muito do setor empresarial, que é o setor que eu represento, mas em todas essas discussões, um dos papéis do CEBEDES também é articular com a sociedade civil e com os outros atores aí para essa construção. Então, desejo a todos um ótimo evento. Vou estar aí o dia todo à disposição, para a gente poder trocar um pouco mais também. E, Marcelo, agradeço de novo a oportunidade aqui. Obrigado. Bom dia a todos.
Obrigado, Ricardo. Bom dia, obrigado pela presença. Como a Priscila explicou, o que a gente vai fazer agora são duas pequenas intervenções. Vou começar com uma intervenção do Simon, depois do Tony, depois nós três vamos aqui fazer um bate-papo com vocês. Eu já queria fazer dois lembretes. O primeiro, quem quiser e precisar de tradução simultânea, é só pegar ali fora, talvez tenha alguns equipamentos aqui dentro. A outra é, já vá pensando perguntas ou questionamentos que vocês queiram fazer, porque a gente está aproveitando esta conversa para também fazer uma escuta, para que Simon e Tony possam ouvir um pouco o que pensa o setor sobre estas questões. Então, com isso, por favor, Simon, bem-vindo. Faça aqui a sua contribuição. E, Tony, eu ia sugerir que você pode ficar aí, assim ele faz a apresentação dele, depois você faz a sua, e depois a gente senta os três aqui, só para não ficar aquela coisa constrangedora de ter que ficar de costas. Por favor.
I'm going to wander over here, I think, because there's a couple of slides I'm going to show you. Here, there's a slide machine. So good morning. I think I have it. All good. I'll shout if there's a problem or cry. Firstly, thank you very much indeed for the invitation, and obviously particularly to Natureza for hosting this meeting. It's an interesting moment, perhaps for the rest of the world to catch up a little bit with where Brazil is. So although Tony and I are billed as bringing news from elsewhere, as Marcelo said, actually, we're here in the iconic nature economy, and so I think there's an awful lot to learn and draw from what you have been doing for many, many years. I'm going to do a little bit of a warm-up act for Tony, talk a little bit more broadly about the nature economy, and in particular, if this works, I'm going to talk a little bit about a second task force. So you've got two task forces in the room. One is the task force on nature-related financial disclosure, which Tony will talk about in a minute. And the second is this task force on nature markets. And the reason I think Marcelo suggested that I should begin with some opening comments is, of course, measuring risk and reporting on risk is critical, but it's critical in the context of what happens in the real economy. And so the real question is, what is the nature economy that we're all going to be party to evolving? And then we can see how the role of measuring nature-related risk and disclosing it as a business and as a financial institution can be a contributor to developing that, if you like, nature-positive economy. And there are many different terms that are used. I think bioeconomy is discussed a lot here as well. And so at the beginning of 2022, this task force was set up, a short life task force for 18 months with 15 absolutely amazing people. You'll be pleased to know I'm not going to go through each of them, but you will notice that Joachim Levy is a member of the task force, and Chief Almir Surwea is a member of the task force. You have two Brazilian representatives, very different experiences, different perspectives, but also folks from the technology side, from the finance side, Hank Paulson, from the blockchain technology side, Katrina Doherty from Australia. So many different pieces of the puzzle that will contribute to us thinking about and working on this subject. And the mandate established in 22 was, if we have an emergence of a nature economy, how do we govern that economy in the right way? And that speaks, Ricardo, I've lost you already, wherever you are, there you are, to this sort of question of what are the rules of the game, as well as obviously the enterprising and dynamic and innovative businesses that need to operate within those rules. And so that was the, if you like, mandate of this task force to think about this topic. I'm guessing I don't need to tell you much about nature and biodiversity, but I'm going to tell you a couple of things. One, Ricardo quoted the number 44% of the global economy super dependent on biodiversity. Of course, 100% of the global economy is dependent on nature. It's all around us. We are it. There is nothing else to work for. And biodiversity is a piece of that, and an important piece of that story. Yeah. And if one looks at the sort of the top end numbers, they don't look good. Global biodiversity estimated to have declined by 70% since 1970. Remember, biodiversity, is the underpinning of our agricultural system, but of many other aspects of the way in which our global economy functions and which people's livelihoods depend. And of course, why has it declined? Well, principally because we don't price it, principally because we don't count it properly, principally because we treat it as if it's there forever and there's an endless amount of it and we can use it as much as we want. And of course, we all know that that's nonsense. Yeah? And so we have a global economy that doesn't price nature correctly. And the question is, how do we fix that problem? Do we protect it so that it doesn't get anywhere near the nature economy? Do we regulate? Do we price it? There are many different ways in which we can bring the value of nature into the way in which business does its business. And that is kind of the job, if you like, or at least one of the core questions that really we were taking on as part of this task force. And just to give you sort of one other number, and then I'll leave it in peace. So this is a World Bank estimate, so you can never quite trust that, but it's kind of more or less useful. The global food system is an $8 trillion a year food system. So think of global GDP as being $100 trillion. So the global food system is like a big chunk of the story, right? So the World Bank estimates that negative externalities, so effects of the global food system that are not paid for by the global food system, are $12 trillion a year. That's nature, climate, bad public health outcomes, a whole bunch of stuff that I won't go into in any detail. So what does that ridiculous set of numbers mean? Well, it means that if the global food system was a single company in a world where everything was priced correctly, it would be bankrupt. Yeah, its costs would way exceed the revenues that it brings in. Yeah, and that's not only the problem with the global food system, that's the problem with our global economy, which is that our impacts on nature and the costs of those impacts to us all, including those side effects on the climate agenda through nature effects, actually far exceed the value of our global economy. And so how do we fix that? It's not a simple sort of, let's change that price. Yeah, it's a much bigger transformation that we really need to think about going forward. One task force, of course, can't solve all those questions, but hopefully we felt it could make a contribution. And part of the contribution was about numbers, that we began looking at what are the markets in the global economy where nature is priced. And where increasingly we're seeing nature separated from other parts of the way those markets work and priced, whether they're priced in terms of you pay this amount for this piece of nature. Think about food as an obvious example, nature, or whether it's priced through a risk lens, which we'll hear about more in a second. If you're sitting in a financial institution, you're pricing it through risk and asset valuation. These are all ways in which nature is increasingly being priced. And the good news, and I think it is exceedingly good news, is that we are at a moment in history where nature is, if you like, coming out of the dark and is being increasingly priced in global markets. So actually, we're at a pivot point where for hundreds of years, nature has been ignored in the way it contributed to markets, and today is being increasingly priced through a whole series of different ways. But of course, that may be good because we need to price nature, but there may also be risks associated with the commoditization of nature, with the financialization of nature, the monetization of nature. Yeah, that clearly, if everything reduces to $1 or reales, yeah, that has some advantages because it means we value nature in a particular way. But we all know that if we reduce all value to a question of dollars and reales, there are downsides to the way in which our lives progress. So that balance between valuing nature more broadly and valuing nature through price mechanisms becomes a critical part of our design challenge. And over the 18 months, the task force has done many pieces of work, has published many technical papers, has had many engagements. You can look at all of those online at the website of the task force. We've done a whole lot of definitions, a whole lot of quantitative analysis, just trying to understand what that historical pivot point really looks like as more and more markets begin to price nature going forward. Like I said, risks and opportunities. The opportunity and the need is to price nature, yeah, but what comes along with that? And I just want to perhaps just highlight 3 examples very briefly, just to make the point. All of you know what carbon markets are. Well, what comes after carbon markets? Biodiversity credit markets. So we're beginning to see a surge in interest, not just in the carbon aspects of biodiversity, so the ability of forests to store carbon and so on, that I'm sure some of you are involved in, but how do you begin to price biodiversity credits that are not just a function of the carbon value of that biodiversity, but other aspects of the way in which biodiversity counts in the global economy. A few weeks ago, at a summit in Paris, in fact, that President Lula attended, hosted by President Macron, a global roadmap was launched to try and build the rules of the game for biodiversity credit markets going forward. WBCSD, very much involved. In fact, we had representatives of the Brazilian government in the room as this global roadmap was launched. 18 months on, this may turn out to be a really important part of how, for example, financial flows can move into the Amazon more effectively to support standing landscapes, not just how to store carbon, but really other aspects of what standing landscapes really give one. So a new market beginning to emerge here. Opportunities, yes. Whether it will really work, function of how we design them and build them. If I come down here, we heard a little bit about data from Ricardo. My goodness, yes, it's a real data challenge. And this is Leanne Sharif. She runs a biodata company and she sits on the task force for nature markets. So the whole issue of what kind of biodata is going to flow through, but not only that, but who owns that data and who pays for that data? And is that data purely privatized in markets, or is it more broadly available not only to governments but other actors in the societies around us, has become a big issue. Biodata markets are already a multi-billion-dollar market, yeah, but who really is going to reap the benefits from those markets? It clearly feeds the ability to measure risk. The markets themselves are a challenge as to how they will be developed over time. And the third example I was going to give was Carlos Lopez, who was the head of UN Africa for a number of years, sits on our task force. And his point, again, is slightly different. The EU, as some of you will know, has imposed a zero deforestation due diligence regulation that will require you, by which I mean Brazil, to demonstrate for any exports to the EU that there was no deforestation involved in the production of those exports. Now, morally, and in other ways, we may say that's a good thing. We're obviously all interested in zero deforestation. But is this the way to do it? Does that begin to create trade barriers, for example, for Brazil and other commodity exporters? Is it the job of the EU to set rules that exist in Brazil, or is it the job of Brazil to set rules that exist in Brazil? And how's that going to work going forward? So as policies and regulations and standards begin to lock in, the question of who's setting them, what they're really about, and who's bearing the cost of the transition. We can all agree that we want to stop destroying nature, but can we all agree on who's going to bear the costs of what that transition is really going to look like? And that's the point that Carlos is making in this quote, and is certainly a major feature of the task force work. A couple more minutes, Marcelo, wherever you've gone, and I will come to a stop. So the task force on nature markets comes to an end this week on Thursday in Belém, where we will launch the final report of its findings and recommendations. And clearly, it's just a task force. Yeah, it can't possibly solve, let alone implement, the array of changes that are needed to create the nature economy we really need going forward. But we think that it has made a significant contribution. It will set out a number of major recommendations, including, again, back to one of Ricardo's observations, the need for leadership from the sovereign area, such as Brazil, as well as from the business area, such as yourselves, in thinking about what the rules of the game are for global markets to ensure that we drive nature-positive businesses going forward. Part of the reason for launching here in Belém on Thursday is obviously this is the nature economy, or at least a major iconic variant of that, partly because the Amazon in Brazil and beyond Brazil is one of the great nature landscapes, but also because Brazil has these global leadership moments, the G20, COP30, and simply being who it is in the global economy at this moment in time. And so we hope that this is both a contribution in itself, correctly launched in Belém, but is also a way of encouraging and supporting Brazil's leadership in this area going forward. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Tony, the ball is with you.
Thank you, Marcelo. Terrific to be here. Thank you for having me. It's my first time to Brazil, and from the perspective of the task force, it actually feels like we are overdue to be in Brazil. We were waiting for things to settle into place here, and now feels like an excellent time to be here. So first of all, thank you to you, Priscilla and Italsa, for hosting us. Thank you also to Ricardo, who I think has just stepped out of the room, but for the excellent support we've had from SEBDES in hosting and convening our consultation group in Brazil. We were delighted that they put up their hand and was one of the first countries to set up a consultation group for the TNFD. We have 11 around the world now, and we've got probably 5 or 6 more we are going to announce very shortly, and then more to follow in the years to come as we move towards scaling up market adoption. So we're really delighted that Brazil has been at the forefront. I was just saying thank you to you, Ricardo, while you stepped out of the room. So now that you're here, I will acknowledge you in person. Thank you for all of your support. So we're really delighted that Brazil has played such an important role in the design and development phase of the work of the task force. In addition to having a consultation group here, we have 5 of our 40 task force members are Brazilians, 2 from Brazilian companies, so Suzano and Natura, but 3 other task force members representing global corporations who are very proudly Brazilian, so a very strong Brazilian voice on the task force. And I think what I wanted to do today was give you a bit of an update of where we are with the work of the task force. I'll give you a sneak peek of the final recommendations, which will be launched in New York on the 18th of September, so only in a few weeks' time. And then maybe a bit of a sense about what I think is the opportunity for Brazil to continue to lead on this agenda. Because I do think, looking globally, you are almost unique in having the ability to lead on the nature and the nature finance agenda for so many reasons. So I'd like to offer a few thoughts around why that's the case. So I think we've heard from Priscilla, from Ricardo, from Simon about why we have to focus on nature loss, not just because we're 100% dependent on nature, but also from a business and finance perspective. That means nature risk. And one of my key messages that I wanted to leave with all of you today is we need to get nature into the strategic risk registry of business and finance, just like any other type of risk. And in some ways, that sounds like a very boring answer. But I would encourage all of you working in business, in finance, you need to think about risk, think about nature as a source of risk as you do with cyber or any other type of operational risk. And what's really interesting, I make the analogy to cyber risk because business around the world has spent billions of dollars in the last 5 to 10 years trying to address cyber risk. No board executive, no company executive now would want to be caught short not having appropriate risk management in place around cyber. If investors ask, you're expected to be on top of your cyber risk, and if you're not, there'd be questions about the leadership of the company. And what's interesting about the comparison between cyber risk and nature risk is that Professor Partha Dasgupta, who wrote the Economics of Biodiversity report from the UK government 2 years ago, he points out that nature has these 3 characteristics which make it very difficult to manage as a risk issue. It's silent, it's invisible, and it's mobile in the way in which it operates. And in fact, those are the same characteristics around cyber risk. And so both of them are very, very difficult to manage as a risk vector for risk for a business or for a portfolio or a loan portfolio or an investment portfolio. So we've done this before. We've been investing and making our businesses more resilient in the face of cyber risk. We now need to do the same in the face of nature risk. So at some level, this is quite straightforward and maybe even boring, that we just need to think about nature as a new source of risk. It's got to move from the corporate social responsibility department into the risk department. That's really the transformation that TNFD is trying to support. And once it's in the CFO's column, once it's treated as a central risk issue, no longer just as a corporate social responsibility issue, I think we will have made a huge amount of progress. So that's the reason why I think this is so important. At the moment, nature is a source of risk to business. There's nature risk in your balance sheet. There's nature risk in your investment portfolio. There's nature risk in your loan portfolio. You just haven't had the tools to see it. And so part of what TNFD is doing, the reason why we are focused on risk management and disclosure, is we're not just trying to publish a set of disclosure requirements. We're also trying to provide a set of tools for risk management, because it's like a flashlight. Once we have the flashlight, we can see nature risk. Once we can see it, we can manage it. We can do something about it. So we started our work in October 2021. We committed to having the recommendations and a suite of guidance developed within 2 years. So I'm delighted that we've hit those milestones. We've stayed on track, and we'll be publishing our recommendations on the 18th of September in New York. We'll be releasing our recommendations at the New York Stock Exchange on the 18th, so only in a matter of weeks. The task force will then continue, and we will switch our focus from designing and developing the recommendations to supporting capability building with market participants. And obviously this is going to be a big challenge because nature is a new topic. This is much like everyone coming to terms with climate risk 10 years ago, and most people in business and finance had no idea what scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions were. So we're going to have to go on a similar journey now on nature, and it's going to be different from climate. As much as we would all like to cut and paste what we have learnt on climate and apply it to the rest of nature, the context is different. We can't just do exactly the same thing. So a big piece of the work of the task force has been to think about where we are today on climate risk management. What can we take forward from the climate experience and build on that, recognizing that people have invested a lot in their organizations in the last 5 years in particular, building those skills and capabilities. And how do we then recognize the differences in the nature context and support building the capacity and the skills around managing nature risk as a different but related set of issues. So our recommendations are coming on in September. What are we releasing? We're releasing 14 disclosure recommendations. They will be very aligned with the ISSB's new standards for sustainability reporting, S1 and S2. We're doing everything we can to align as much as possible with the ISSB's approach. They are aligned with the Global Biodiversity Framework and the policy targets that were agreed in Montreal last year. And we're very much building on the approach of TCFD. So for those of you who've worked hard to adopt the TCFD approach on climate, we've taken the same structure, the same language, and the same approach as TCFD, which of course has now been folded into the ISSB standards, and TCFD has essentially closed as of the last month or two. So TNFD is coming up with 14 recommendations. All 11 TCFD disclosure recommendations are carried over. They're copied into the nature context, and we have 3 additional disclosures that we think are really important. So that's the 14. In addition to the 14 disclosures, we're also publishing a set of guidance to help people get started. And the task force, when it began its work almost 2 years ago, one of our first decisions was we have to have a bias towards action. We can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Even though nature is complex for people in business and finance to understand, we have to break it down into a set of concepts and things that can be understood. And we have to get business moving into action. So part of the package we will be releasing in September is a set of guidance. How do we do this? Not just what are the disclosures, but how do we get there? What's the assessment process? And I'm pleased to say that we've developed both the disclosure recommendations and the guidance with a huge amount of input from the market over the last 18 months. As many of you know, we took this open innovation approach, quite novel in the area of developing frameworks and standards. And I'm thrilled that the market has responded so positively. And in fact, Brazil in the last 6 months has entered the top 10 countries for those giving us feedback on the design of the framework. So we've had a lot of Brazilian input as well. And the response has been quite overwhelming. So we've had about 750,000 views of our website for the draft framework. We've received over 3,000 feedback submissions, some very detailed, making excellent suggestions, telling us what works, what doesn't work, what they want to see more of. And perhaps most importantly, we've had 200 institutions around the world testing the framework. So because we published it in stages, we've had companies able to test it and give us very valuable feedback from their testing, including a number of pilot tests here in Brazil, which has been terrific. Because obviously every context is different. And so we've been learning a huge amount across different geographies, different regulatory jurisdictions, and different biomes of nature, land, freshwater, ocean, etc. And all of that feedback has influenced the design of the recommendations. So we're very confident that come September when we release them, we have a very good sense now that business can get started. This is not sort of conceptually nice, it's practical. There is enough in there for business to start with. And we're not expecting anyone to do all 14 disclosures in their first year subject to third-party audit and assurance. That's the destination, that's the goal. But we need to get as many businesses and financial institutions moving as we can. And the important thing is, with climate, of course, we can make a lot of progress on climate change just by targeting the companies that are the biggest emitters in any given economy and globally. On nature, every business touches nature. It's somewhere either in its direct operations or in its value chain. So we have a much bigger challenge, which is we have to build a framework and an approach that can be used by small to medium-sized enterprises as well as the world's biggest global multinational corporations. And so we've had to think very carefully around measurement, as Ricardo said before, what needs to get measured, and where is the data going to come from in order to support the disclosure statements, the reporting. And so we have to think about data much like a supply chain. There's a data chain. The data is going to have to flow from farmers on the ground all the way through the supply chain to the end producer of a hamburger or a steak or a consumer good product. So we've got a lot of complexity around metrics and data. And so to solve for that problem, what we've done at the task force is we've looked at all of the metrics that are already being used, around which we found about 3,000 being used in current company reporting by UN statistical agencies, by other standards bodies, etc. Clearly that's overwhelming, that's not helpful. And so we have landed on a leading indicators approach to metrics. And so we have 3 tiers of metrics which we think should be used. Some that apply to all businesses in all sectors, some that are sector specific. And the third category are metrics that we recommend that be used, that each business should consider based on its own business model and its own sector. So it's a very flexible approach, but we're trying to arrive at an approach that is both science-based on the one hand and practical to implement on the other. And that has not been an easy challenge. And I'm sure we'll get some questions around that in the discussion to follow. To support that work going forward, we're also looking to encourage governments and other market participants to get behind the idea of a global data facility for nature-related data. Some of you will be aware on the climate side, there is an initiative called NZDPU. It must be the worst acronym in sustainable finance. But the NZDPU is looking to collect data on how companies are doing with their transition to net zero. Very valuable initiative. It's now 18 months along. But we think there is a case for a global data utility for nature-related data that would be about the state of nature, because this is the thing that is the hardest to find and to aggregate. If my business is operating in a part of the Brazilian Amazon, how do I know what the state of nature is in that particular location against which I need to assess my performance as a business? Very hard to find that data on a globally consistent basis. And if you're a big global company operating in countries around the world, you have very complex supply chains, the ability to do that repeatedly is extremely difficult. So we think there's a case for a global data facility which will help to drive a standardization of data on state of nature and make that data accessible to market participants and including governments as well to help them develop their own national bioeconomy strategies and action plans on tackling nature loss. So this is going to be another big initiative that we're planning to pursue in the next few years as we try to continue to make this easier and easier for companies and financial institutions to embrace. So I might stop there. There's a lot of other aspects of what we're doing, but I think the headlines are recommendations are coming in September, 14 disclosure recommendations, a suite of additional guidance to help get business and finance moving. And we've got a number of big initiatives we're going to be continuing to work on with many others to try and continue to make this easier for business and finance to do going forward. I just wanted to finish with a few thoughts about the opportunity that I think is there for Brazil, and I'd really like to listen to your reactions to these in the discussion to follow. So I think there are sort of four areas where I think Brazil is perhaps uniquely placed to help to lead on these efforts going forward. The first is around metrics and the data chain that I mentioned. We need to continue to test whether we're looking at the right metrics and how that flow of data is going to move from small to medium-sized enterprises along the value chains up to the big corporations that might be listed on the Brazilian exchange or other exchanges around the world. Because of the size and because of the complexity of your nature-business relationship, I think Brazil is probably a really good testing ground to see what's working and what's not working and how we improve that over time. So that's the first area. The second area is around improving the engagement between business and indigenous communities. As we know, indigenous communities are custodians of about 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. So they have a disproportionately important role to play in tackling nature loss. And as we all know, globally, there's been a huge challenge in the relationship between business and indigenous communities, particularly the way in which they engage each other, whether it's productive, whether it's unproductive, whether there's enough dialogue or not enough dialogue, whether it's based on free, prior, informed consent. There's a number of now very well established international principles, and we have developed guidance for the engagement between business and indigenous people that we think needs to be an important part of TNFD related disclosures. And I think this is an area where both indigenous communities could learn about how they can better engage business, and clearly business needs to know how to better engage indigenous communities. So one thing we're very interested in doing in the next few years is some capacity building projects that will help both sides more effectively engage in dialogue around the relationship between business and nature, to improve the response to nature loss and the way in which business projects are moved through the development stages with the consent and support of indigenous communities. And of course, the huge opportunity here is to see if we can tap into their traditional knowledge of the ecosystems and the landscapes they're in to find new business models that contribute to nature positive outcomes. So it's not just improving the current dialogue, it's moving to an entirely new place in the way in which we relate to each other and try and find these new opportunities. The third big opportunity that I think for Brazil is leading the world in trying to scale nature-based solutions. And I say this is unique for Brazil because we will only find, the whole world is interested in scaling nature-based solutions. At the moment, there's a lot of people on social media promoting new green bond initiatives, blue bond initiatives, nature-based solutions. But when we look at the ticket size, they're all very small. We're talking in the tens of millions of dollars. We need to get to hundreds of millions and billions of dollars. And so there's an issue right now of scaling. Many of the solutions are great, but how are we going to take them to scale? The only places in the world that are going to be able to figure that out are large economies, and this taps into the whole bioeconomy opportunity that's ahead. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what the Brazilian government announces this week. So Brazil as a large bioeconomy with huge potential to lead in this space, this is really a call to action to your finance community. You can be global leaders in trying to find and scale up the solutions to nature-based solutions, because it's going to come from an economy like Brazil's. So I think this is potentially a really unique opportunity for Brazil to lead going forward. I'm originally from Australia, and well, not originally, I am Australian. That's my origin story. And 25 years ago, I worked in project finance in infrastructure. And many of you who've worked in that area will know that Australia, small economy, became a world leader in infrastructure project finance. And even to this day, 25 years later, Australia has financial institutions that are world leaders in structured finance and project finance around infrastructure. And that's because Australia moved early and applied itself to figuring out innovative financing solutions in that particular space. And so there's a precedent there. These innovations don't have to come out of London or New York or Tokyo. They can come from anywhere in the world. And I think the opportunity to scale nature-based solutions is a uniquely powerful one for the Brazilian finance sector to lead on. So let me stop there. I look forward to the discussion and learning from all of you. So thank you very much.
Simon, why don't you join us here? Bom, pega o seu. Muito obrigado pelas palavras iniciais. Vou deixar o tempo, Tony, para você colocar seu... distribuir os microfones, isso é importante. Obrigado. Eu queria dizer que é um enorme prazer estar aqui, porque eu colidero essa força-tarefa com o Simon, com o meu chapéu Nature Finance, e trabalho com Maria Fernanda, Fred e Priscila aqui na Itaúsa para a gente colocar uma estratégia ESG. E não são todos os dias que eu consigo fazer as duas coisas juntas como eu estou conseguindo agora. Então, eu estou muito feliz de estar podendo juntar esses dois lados de um mesmo chapéu aqui. Depois eu parei para pensar, Alfredo, e falei, ao mesmo tempo, agora eu estou com 2 CEOs que me supervisam aqui, e estou achando que vocês vão ter uma ideia de fazer uma avaliação 360 ainda hoje sobre o meu trabalho. Aí eu já falei, puxa, talvez não tivesse sido uma boa ideia trazer todo mundo junto na mesma sala, mas a vida é risco, então está tudo certo. Então, muito prazer e muito obrigado, Alfredo e Simon, por estarem aqui investindo nessa jornada. Bom, eu vou começar com uma pergunta, e a ideia é a gente fazer perguntas que realmente provoquem avanços. A gente falou muito de oportunidades aqui, a gente comentou muito sobre o papel fundamental que o Brasil pode ter nessa jornada, mas, ao mesmo tempo, eu acho que está muito claro para nós que o Brasil, em geral, e o setor financeiro, em particular, ainda está engatinhando muito no seu conforto para abordar essa agenda de natureza. E, como bem dito aqui, a gente tem uma cúpula acontecendo na Amazônia esta semana, que está juntando já as principais economias amazônicas, que certamente será o grupo de biodiversidade e de bioeconomia maior que a gente tem no mundo. Temos um importante ano, o ano que vem, quando o Brasil será a presidência do G20, e teremos um ano de atividades do G20 no Brasil. Então, se a gente quer falar sobre economia e o que o mundo deve pensar, é o ano que vem, durante o G20, que esse tema tem que entrar. Depois teremos a cúpula do clima, com a COP30 no Brasil. Bom, a gente já está acostumado a ter oportunidade no Brasil. Já tivemos Rio 92, Rio +10, Rio +20, e pode ser uma oportunidade perdida. Para que não seja uma oportunidade perdida, a pergunta para você, Simon, é: o que você acha que os países ricos em natureza não deveriam deixar de fazer? E, como você bem disse, se a gente ficar aqui no conforto de deixar o mundo andar, primeiro vem a regulação europeia, depois vem a de UK, depois vem a americana, e a gente vai ficar servindo a várias regulações, ao invés de definir qual é o nosso caminho. Qual seria a sua leitura sobre como o mundo está vendo países ricos em natureza? Então, são 2 perguntas em uma. Oportunidades para o Brasil, olhando especialmente para a G20, e como você acha que o mundo, e aí pode ser até as 20 maiores economias, olham para esse tema. E também não adianta o Brasil falar, puxa, que boa ideia, vou trazer esse tema no G20, e as 20 maiores economias do mundo não estão interessadas nisso. Dado que você tem circulado muito por esse tema e por essas economias, qual é a tua leitura disso?
Thanks. So we're allowed to be a little provocative here, I take from your comments. Thanks, Marcelo. Look, nature-rich economies have historically been a place to extract value and now a place to store carbon. That's how the world sees it, right? And that's not okay. Yeah. It's not okay for all the obvious reasons that any citizen of Brazil or any sensible person anywhere in the world would understand. Yeah, but it is true that Brazil is an exporter of nature, embodied in food and in many other respects. And so surely, for you to be an exporter of nature, you need to be paid a fair price. Yeah, and actually, you know, if we just cross from biodiversity to oil for a second, that contentious subject, OPEC countries figured that out. Yeah, that they also, oil producers historically, were just a point of extraction, as we know, in days gone past with many military exercises. And the formation of OPEC with all its strengths and weaknesses has enriched oil-producing countries by trillions of dollars extra, and has provided them with a voice in the world. We may agree with it, we may disagree with it, but has provided oil-producing countries with a different voice in global markets and the political space. What would an equivalent for nature be? Can one imagine, I hate to use the term, an OPEC for nature? How might that work? What would it mean for you and other nature-rich countries to consider the value of nature in global markets and to negotiate or perhaps assert the way it should be priced? That seems at least one end of one's imagination. And indeed, Brazil, Indonesia, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo created an alliance of rainforest countries just, what, a year and a half ago? And so that imagination in some way is out there. Who are we that steward nature, and how can we ensure that it is stewarded effectively, but that it is also rewarded effectively in global markets? So that seems to me a sort of one end of the story, and obviously a provocation, but perhaps the right provocation for us to consider. And then just at the other end, we see a number of different initiatives, markets, policies emerging around nature. TNFD is an example of that. Is Brazil sufficiently engaged? Well, I would say actually in the case of TNFD, probably the answer is yes. Yeah, there's been an enormous input from direct Brazilian members, as well as piloting companies and civil society organizations that have made contributions. But when the EU established its zero deforestation due diligence regulation, where was your voice? Well, we know. Brazil put together a position of 14 commodity exporters and communicated its displeasure to Brussels, saying, this imposes the cost of burden on us. We can all agree that we need to protect nature, but we need to talk about how, and we need to talk about who pays the bill. Yeah, simply driving nature into our trade arrangements today will simply mean that we pay the price, and that yes, perhaps we will collectively benefit. That seems to be a lousy way of doing business. And so it seems there's been many comments about the G20. The G20 has pluses and minuses, but it is one of a number of forums where trade and investment policy, financial regulation, monetary policy is negotiated, where common approaches are evolved. And that has never been done at the G20 in the context of a nature economy. And so to prevent unilateral acts such as coming out of Brussels, even if we think it's a good idea in some ways, one can't just complain. One needs to take advantage of the roles that one has to create the right conversation to get the right rules in place. And then my final example, and I'll come back to you. I mentioned biodiversity credit markets. Well, for those of you involved in carbon markets, particularly voluntary carbon markets, there's only one word to describe it, which is a mess, a total mess. Yeah, and it wasn't a mess by mistake. It was a mess by design. Yeah, that there was a long process of designing how voluntary carbon markets were going to work. And one of the things that was taken off the table was price. No price floors. So you pay $5 a ton in Belém, sell it for $105 a ton in Brussels or in Washington or in Beijing. That's not okay. Yeah. And so here we are again, biodiversity credit markets. Where's Brazil? Are you part of the conversation of how the rules of the road of those markets are going to evolve over the coming years? Or in 2 or 3 years, are you going to turn around and go, that's another mess? Yeah, the opportunity is there. It needs to be taken. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Tony, I am going through an exercise here at Itaúsa with all the different areas of the organization. We're trying to figure out what are the core indicators that we could use to monitor our portfolio, as well as look as guidance for eventually new acquisitions and new investments. And TNFD has popped up as one of the things we may want to share with the companies we have in the portfolio and ourselves as an exercise to actually start understanding what is our nature dependence. In doing that, I've learned that, number one, TNFD is not so well known as we would like to. So I think events like this are very important for that. But as we saw in other ESG scenarios, one thing is someone talking about it. The other one is someone doing something about it. And I think you were very clear that for a country like Brazil, given that our emission portfolio, although we call it climate exposure, it's actually a nature exposure because 70% of our emissions are nature related. The energy related emissions are much smaller. We're almost like an inverse of the rest of the planet. So nature should be a much more important conversation for Brazil, therefore a higher risk issue. But then when you go to the finance community, and you gave cyber as an example where we have hyper trading, loans for bonds and so on, the system seems to decide in a magical way when the system is comfortable with the accuracy and when it's not. And I keep hearing that nature is too complicated. And because it's too complicated, people don't want to engage. And yet, it seems to me that we engage with so many complicated stuff in the financial sector that we also don't know the answer. Yet for those, we don't say it's too complicated. Cybersecurity, super complicated, but we're kind of comfortable because we understand that that's the way it goes and we accept the risk. Question for you. Number one is, how are you perceiving as you're doing this globally? What is the appetite for nature risk? The second question would be, for a country like Brazil, where we do have a lot of data, we're probably the only country that has the satellite monitoring of land that any other country does not have. So we have a lot of data and intelligence. What is, in your view, the missing element or the secret sauce that we could share with the financial community to spark people to start wanting to do something about it?
Can you hear me okay? Yep. Two difficult questions. I might take the second one first. So on the data side, I think we did a gap analysis on nature-related data about 18 months ago. And the findings, and we worked with a big community of data providers on that work. And the key conclusion was there's not a lack of nature-related data out there. It's an issue of market participants knowing where to find it, its accessibility and comparability and the quality of the data. There's actually quite a lot of nature-related data that's already been collected. So I think the opportunity for Brazil is to lead efforts at a national level, which can then be replicated elsewhere, to liberate that data, to take it out of the places where it's stuck, maybe in scientific institutions or government bodies, and make that data that's already available more widely accessible as a starting point. Of course, there will be data gaps that need to be filled. There are methodology issues that need to be addressed. Those will take longer. And we do need a set of global standard data methodologies for assessing the state of nature. That's something that we hope to contribute to in the next couple of years. But right now, there's a lot of nature-related data that's available. Probably, as you said, deeper pools of that here in places like Brazil than in many other countries. So step number one is making the data that you already have more accessible to business and finance. We've heard, lots of stories. Nature data has typically been collected by scientists and academics. Many of them from the global north. They go to the global south. They do their field expeditions and surveys. They get the data, and it gets trapped in a research center in the UK or the US or something, even though it may be data from the Amazon in Brazil. So we've got to get that data out. It has to be available to market participants so it can be used. So that's really the first step. The second thing that's come out of the pilot testing that we've done is that a lot of big organizations, particularly those in very regulated sectors like mining, for example, food and beverage, they already have quite a lot of data internally, maybe in the environment department. But other parts of the organization don't know what the data is because it's typically been managed by one or two people. And so even within organizations, the first thing to do is to go and find out what data do we actually already have internally from our own existing efforts. And we know that, for example, food and beverage companies, some of them big global players, are spending millions of dollars a year collecting their own on-ground data in the ecosystems in which they operate, because they can't rely on public data sources in those locations. So they go and send their own scientists, they do their own surveying, and they have their own on-the-ground data. So there's data inside organizations. Sometimes people in corporate reporting don't know what the environment department might have within their own organization. And then the bigger challenge that we have going forward is that more and more of the new nature-related data that's going to be collected will come from private sector sources, like satellite providers. So we need to build, as we think about this idea of a global data facility that we've started to explore, we're going to have to build a model which is not just data from government statistical agencies and public sources, but also a platform that can bring in data from private sector sources, because more and more of this data is going to be collected by private sector sources, satellite providers, organizations collecting eDNA, so DNA from from rivers and from soil samples, etc. So the challenge is really about accessibility, the standardization of the methods, and then the accessibility of the data. And at the moment, some of the key data sources that people have been using to pilot test TNFD are stuck behind paywalls. And so that immediately creates a barrier to use. And so we've got a series of steps. But I think finding the data that's in your organization, finding the data that's in national data systems that the government can play a role to liberate and make more accessible are two places to start. Yeah, well, I think it's changing rapidly, and I think similar to Simon's comments, we're starting to see a lot of interest in new data solutions in the private sector, and so there's actually new markets for nature-related data that are emerging, and that's driving a huge amount of innovation. So I think because investors are seeking more information, we're seeing the data providers providing new nature-related data tools and platforms. And so I think the whole landscape is going to be transformed because there is an increasing recognition from investors that they need more nature-related data. They're going to have to go and find it, and that's stimulating a lot of innovation. Now, the TNFD metrics approach, as I mentioned, we surveyed the landscape. We found thousands of metrics that are in use, and we decided fairly quickly that was not going to be very helpful. So we've taken this approach of focusing on a small set of leading indicators and a flexible framework for using metrics. And we've had a number of investors come to us saying, can we just take your approach to metrics and use that as part of our investment selection process and a capital allocation process? And we would expect people to start to do that. And I've had several discussions with investors saying, we want to create a TNFD aligned investment portfolio, where part of our proposition to investors is that we're using the TNFD metrics to assess both our positive and negative impacts on nature. So that will be one of the interesting things to see that comes out from our work, is how will parts of the TNFD approach be taken and used in different contexts. And I would expect that our metrics architecture will be one of those things that other people can use for new investment funds, new investment products, supporting capital allocation decisions.
Thank you. Bom, aproveitando que a gente tem mais de 100 pessoas acompanhando a gente online, eu já estou recebendo perguntas online. Eu já dei aquele aviso para vocês começarem a esquentar aí, pensando alguma pergunta ou comentário que vocês queiram fazer. Mas para garantir que vocês se sintam estimulados, eu já alertei 2 pessoas da audiência que eu ia fazer uma intervenção colocando eles em foco. E agora chegou a hora. Então, primeiro eu vou pedir Marcelo Bear, vice-presidente da Natura. Bear, soa muito bom o que a gente está ouvindo aqui. Mas a gente sabe que no Brasil tem aquelas coisas que são boas e colam e as coisas que são boas e não colam. É uma oportunidade boa demais e temos uma crise grande demais para o Brasil dizer eu não tenho nada a ver com isso, até porque nós seremos cobrados, tendo a maior biodiversidade do planeta. Você tem navegado essa questão já há algum tempo, está acabando de chegar da Europa, estava super exposto, é um membro ativo. Você pode dar um depoimento sobre, na sua opinião, quais são as maiores oportunidades e os maiores desafios que as organizações aqui representadas em online terão, querendo participar desse esforço?
Bom dia a todas, bom dia a todos. Super obrigado. Tá ouvindo bem agora? Tá. Super obrigado do convite, da provocação. Tem muitas uniões aqui, né? Eu sou da Natura, aqui estou com vários colegas, eternos colegas, e também do TNFD, participando dessa discussão já há 2 anos. Eu acho essa discussão fundamental, e vou explicar por quê. O Simon colocou muito bem que, em termos de carbono, o mundo vive, de certa forma, uma confusão. Né? Mas é uma confusão na qual os 4 principais elementos já estão bem delimitados. Né? Então, a gente tem uma confusão que temos, no mundo científico, o IPCC, delimitando quais são as emissões, com acordo entre cientistas, com um número que todo mundo concorda. E o Brasil participa desse processo, então, na segunda dimensão, que é a dimensão de política pública, a gente tem o Acordo de Paris, com metas claras, que a gente deve alcançar até 2050. E cada país sabe da sua contribuição, sabe o quanto tem que reduzir. No mundo empresarial, nós temos os Science-Based Targets. A gente tem metas de redução de emissões absolutas, em que é verificado por terceira parte, e a gente sabe como a gente deve se comportar e quais são os principais mecanismos de mudança. E no mundo financeiro, o TCFD, a conexão entre finanças, risco e emissões. Essa mesma dimensão desses 4 elementos não está organizada para o tema de natureza, que é o tema no qual o Brasil certamente tem a maior contribuição a dar, porque somos uma potência da biodiversidade. Discutindo com a Denise Rios, minha querida colega, por muitos anos, como que a gente conseguiria fazer uma estratégia que fosse ao mesmo tempo carbono positiva e natureza positiva, a gente chegou à conclusão de que o mais evidente seria ajudar a organizar essas 4 dimensões a ficarem de pé também. Então, ajudar a organizar, na dimensão científica, um grupo que tivesse a possibilidade de fazer o denominador comum do que é a métrica de natureza. Aqui, acho que vale uma pergunta para o nosso querido CEO de TNFD, se o Tony conseguir endereçar, como está andando essa ideia de uma plataforma mais aberta, porque não haverá um IPCC da natureza. Existe o IPBS, que é uma instituição baseada na Alemanha, que tem por missão olhar como vai ser a natureza, mas não vai ser um lugar centralizado de dados e de acordo único. Temos muitas métricas e muitos caminhos. No campo empresarial, Science-Based Targets para a natureza está se estruturando também, mas é muito inicial. Vai demorar muitos anos para a gente conseguir ter uma conexão entre negócios, os seus efeitos para o mundo da natureza. No mundo da política pública, foi muito citado o acordo da biodiversidade global, lavrado na COP15, ele fez 3 coisas importantes. Uma foi sinalizar a redução pelo sistema ONU dos subsídios a atividades danosas ao meio ambiente. O segundo tema foi instar as empresas a reportarem publicamente a sua contribuição para a perda ou em favor da natureza. Mas o terceiro, talvez mais importante, foi criar as NDCs, que são as NBCEPs, por país. Então, o Brasil tem agora, e para todos fazerem isso nos próximos 2 anos. Então, o Brasil tem agora uma missão de criar qual é a sua estratégia para a natureza e qual é o seu mapa de grandes mudanças que eles estão aqui falando. Terão incentivos financeiros que deverão ser projetos, não de pequenos projetos, mas projetos de centenas de milhões para fazer grandes recuperações. E para isso falta esta quarta dimensão, que é a dimensão financeira de conexão entre finanças, natureza e risco. Isso é a moldura do TNFD. Esse é o lugar onde o TNFD se coloca, e é para isso que é fundamental que quem tem mais a ganhar com isso, que são as empresas brasileiras, consigam reportar dentro dessa plataforma para a gente conseguir mensurar o que é de positivo a ser criado nos próximos anos. O que eu vejo que a gente pode contribuir muito, e o Simon é um especialista em desenvolvimento econômico e em economias na conexão norte e sul, são instrumentos públicos também de crédito. Eu queria lhe ouvir um pouco sobre como a gente conecta a entrada da natureza no produto interno bruto dos países e como a gente valora a natureza, não apenas individualmente como empresa, mas no grande contexto. Eu acho que tem muita contribuição e já muito pensamento a respeito disso. E também para provocar, então, Tony, se você puder também trazer como está se organizando os bancos de dados para que as empresas saibam reportar e saibam por onde olhar. Tem muitos provedores hoje fornecendo serviços de como fazer isso e ainda não tem lição de casa feita. Então, se você pudesse indicar por onde as empresas podem começar, e o sistema financeiro, sobretudo, acho que ajuda muito a todos nós. Obrigado.
Ótimo. Então, eu vou sugerir, Tony, você começa respondendo. Tem uma pergunta para o Simon, que eu passo logo em seguida para você, Simon, por favor.
Thanks very much, and thank you for the question, Marcelo. Look, I think what we've found from our surveying of the data landscape is that, to quote Simon, it's a bit of a mess. There's lots of different databases in lots of different places. There's data standards issues, so that inhibits comparability of the information. But there are a number of places where good quality nature data is available, where companies can get started. We signpost to those sources from the TNFD website. So if people are interested in starting to assess their nature-related issues and their risks, we provide a lot of information off our website about which data sources to use in different parts of that process. And as I said, over time, we'll be working with those data providers to explore the possibility of a global data facility, which will improve the accessibility and the data standards issues. I would just add one more observation on the data side, particularly for financial institutions. There's a lot of interest in seeing if we can get to one metric, like a CO2 equivalent for nature. And there's been a suggestion that we can boil nature down into just one number, and financial institutions in particular can use that number to look across their portfolios. I think there's a number of different approaches that are emerging, and there's several groups, most of them are in Europe, who are looking at these index type numbers or metrics. And we're evaluating those, but at the moment the task force has taken the view that we don't think we can just rely on a single number. Nature is too complicated. So that's why we need to take a portfolio approach to measurement. We need to look at a number of different indicators. They might vary by sector. Of course, there's no point looking at soil fertility if you're a fishing business. And the metrics for a mining operation will be different from the metrics for a farming operation. So we've taken this view that we need to look at a portfolio of metrics. So it will be slightly more complicated than what we've come to on climate, because we don't have the benefit of a greenhouse gas protocol, which defined the unit of measurement for CO2 and CO2 equivalents. But I think we have to be fine with that, because we can look and explore these indices, and we want to encourage that innovation as the task force. We know there are half a dozen of them that are under development now, and hopefully they will continue to progress their development and improve over time. But I think we need to be very cautious about trying to get to one single number as a CO2 equivalent for nature. And frankly, to your point before, Marcelo, we don't do that with investing. I said this recently at a conference in Boston. I said, we don't just use one number for investing. Somebody responded and said, well, we pretty much just look at PE ratio, right? But the reality is we look at a range of numbers when we're assessing financial performance. The cash flow statement, the balance sheet, and the P&L, those have been in evolution for hundreds of years, and we've agreed on a common set of numbers, of metrics that represent the financial position of a company. And that's been the product of centuries of innovation in financial reporting that's got us to international standards for reporting financial performance. And, you know, there are definitions for each of the line items, as any CFO knows, in those three statements, and we apply common definitions. I think we need to get to something similar for nature, rather than just trying to add one additional number to the financial reports, one for climate and one for nature. I think we have to take a slightly more sophisticated approach, and I think we can get there, but it's going to take trial and error and innovation, and that's the role of the standards bodies, following the work of the TNFD. That will play a very important role in moving us in that direction.
Eu vou só fazer uma provocação, Tony, de volta para você. Esperar você pôr. Não, é uma provocação que eu estou fazendo de volta para você, por isso que eu esperei você colocar o fone, porque eu acho que quando a gente usa a palavra e diz é complicado, ela tem uma mensagem negativa que tira a gente da proatividade. Quando a gente diz é complexo, a gente reconhece a complexidade, mas na verdade se torna um desafio, porque a sociedade hoje trabalha com sistemas complexos, particularmente o setor financeiro é um líder de como lidar com sistemas complexos. No entanto, ele tenta descomplicar para, inclusive, ampliar sua base de investidores e pessoas participando da economia. Então, no sentido de incluir mais pessoas participando da economia da natureza, eu acho que a gente precisa começar a reconhecer que natureza é complexa, mas não é tão complicado, né? Acabei de respirar o ar que nos mantém vivos, foi bem simples o que eu fiz. Este ar para estar aqui vem de um processo muito complexo, mas a gente pode usar isso de maneira simples. Simon, você recebeu uma provocação também do BR, por favor. Como é que faz natureza entrar no PIB?
I always get these questions, right? I mean, it's so can I cheat and say something about data as well? Am I allowed to do that?
To add, yes.
Yeah, like we've all sort of become accountants, right? It's one of the, I didn't expect that. So I just want to re-emphasize one thing about the data story, because most of us in the room are quite understandably thinking about data as something we want to use, but we're not thinking about data as having value. Yeah, and I think this is a significant mistake. Yeah, I can illustrate it in all sorts of ways, but let me just give one example. You know, the digital sequencing of biogenetics will be a multi-billion-dollar business, and in some ways already is. Yeah, it's not about extracting something from the forest anymore. It's about the digital sequencing of what's already being extracted. It's just data. Just data. Yeah, now, I think the point I'm making is, don't only think about biodata as a way to help you to make decisions. Think about biodata as a source of business, as a source of value, and as being really important for Brazil. Yeah. Now, at one level, you can approach that politically, and you can ask about data sovereignty issues, yeah, which is reasonable, and we do it in many other areas, as we know. Or you can look at it through a commercial lens and ask, what is the IP of biodata? Yeah, how's that really going to work? And who's going to get paid for what? We heard quite rightly from Tony in his earlier remarks about the importance of indigenous peoples in stewarding nature. But doesn't that mean that the data belongs to them? And who's going to pay them for that data? At the moment, people are only thinking about maybe paying them to look after a tree, yeah, or some landscape. But what about the data itself? How is that going to create a source of wealth? And I can assure you there are many people actively thinking about that topic right now, but I'm not sure that we are in quite the way we need to. So I just wanted to make that observation from the sovereignty side through to the commercial side, through to, in a way, the sort of this issue of whether indigenous people that oversee biodiversity, do they own the data associated with that biodiversity? And what would that really mean if we made a decision in some sense that that should be the case? And then the broader point, apologies, Marcelo, double Marcelo. The kind of broader point I think is big breath. We have 30 years of work producing national environmental accounts, particularly done through the UN, but also in many other ways. And I think that work is important, but it, at least at this point, doesn't have the dynamism that we need given the urgency and the pace of change. So yes, we can talk about how do we build natural capital into GDP measures. I think that's fair enough. Yeah, but actually, there are some perhaps tactical pieces of that to think about first. 2 examples to make the point. So today's sovereign debt markets are the lifeblood of financing for every government on the planet, more or less, apart from very poor countries that are excluded from international capital markets. Yeah. Nature doesn't count much in those markets. Climate, a little bit more now, but only as a source of risk, which effectively means that countries that have greater climate risk pay more for borrowing money. Yeah, so actually it's turned out to be a pure downside for the world's poorest countries. Now, what about nature? So a lot of work that Nature Finance does, the organization that I'm honored to be part of, we do a lot of work on how do you build natural capital into sovereign debt markets. Why? Because it's such a huge part of the financial economy and is so critical to financing for so many countries in many shapes and forms. So it turns out, that today's credit rating agencies, the big 3 as well as others, apart from a drought or some other natural catastrophe, they have no idea what to do with nature. They barely know what to do with climate. Yeah, and so there is a journey to go on to begin to build natural capital, the positive side of it, as well as the negative side of it. A country manages its natural capital really well, say Costa Rica, to take a sort of iconic example. Surely that should improve its sovereign credit rating and reduce the cost of capital because that's a source of value. But I think we're just at the beginning of that. So I would say, Marcelo, yes, there's a sort of piece about environmental and natural capital accounting for GDP, and let's do that. I agree. But actually in the financial space, there are some very large-scale opportunities to begin to build natural capital into many really critical parts of financial and capital markets today.
Obrigado, Simon. Bom, aqui na sala nós temos a primeira CEO mulher do Rabobank na América Latina, Fabiana Alves. E em conversas com a Fabiana, que é sócia da Biomas, que é uma iniciativa de restauração com Banco Itaú, Santander, Suzano, Marfrig, espero não estar esquecendo mais ninguém, mas é só para explicar que, além de competição, é parceira também. A Fabiana lida muito com o mundo do agronegócio brasileiro. E o agronegócio brasileiro é um negócio de natureza. Fabiana, eu queria perguntar para você, não só se você tem alguma pergunta para a turma, ela está lá no fundo da sala, mas se você quiser também fazer algum comentário sobre como você entende que o agronegócio brasileiro olha para a natureza e, eventualmente, olha para iniciativas como essa de falar sobre mercados de natureza e, em particular, uma ferramenta como a TNFD. Bem-vinda.
Bom dia a todos, muito obrigada pela oportunidade. Sim, dentro do mercado financeiro somos concorrentes, Itaú e Rabobank, mas temos trabalhado muito juntos aí para desenvolver o acesso ao crédito para o agronegócio empresarial dentro do Brasil. O agronegócio empresarial significa o agronegócio sério, o agronegócio que se não quer estar relacionado com o que a gente chama de o agronegócio mais destrutivo e ilegal. Eu creio, Marcelo, que o agronegócio no Brasil é nosso grande motor de crescimento. A gente gosta ou não, infelizmente, os outros setores desse país não conseguiram acompanhar a velocidade com que o nosso agronegócio se desenvolveu em termos de produtividade, em termos de eficiência, em termos de relevância para a economia do país. Eu gostaria que essa não fosse a realidade, né? Acho que muitos senso comum que a nossa indústria está sucateada e que nosso setor de serviços está super carente desse tipo de avanço, né, em produtividade, em eficiência e em consciência em relação aos impactos de todas as naturezas, né, social e ambiental. Mas a realidade hoje é essa. O Brasil é um país riquíssimo em natureza, mas é um país extremamente pobre em termos de riqueza para a sua sociedade, e o volume de pessoas que nós ainda temos aí abaixo da linha de pobreza é tremendo. Então, é um grande dilema, eu acho, porque as questões de natureza e as questões de clima são questões mundiais, questões que se relacionam com a humanidade como um todo. Mas as soluções são aplicadas dentro de países, dentro de estados, baseadas em legislações que diferem entre um país e outro. E, embora o objetivo e a importância seja reconhecida, no final do dia, o Brasil, assim como outros países ricos em natureza, infelizmente, tem uma primeira prioridade, né, que é como resolver o seu problema social e o seu problema de fome. Bom, o risco climático e o risco da natureza é um risco que vale para o planeta inteiro, mas ele ainda é percebido como um risco a acontecer. E a fome, ela não é um risco, ela se materializa hoje, amanhã, depois de amanhã e semana que vem. Essa dicotomia entre o que é importante no longo prazo e o que o país precisa resolver agora passa por como o país lida com o agronegócio e como o país se estrutura em termos de planejamento e em termos de prioridades. Essa é uma provocação que eu faço para o Tony e para o Simon, porque a gente precisa, para ter a participação, para ter a voz ativa, para ter a relevância que a gente deveria ter nos fóruns internacionais que discutem todas essas questões e que definem questões tão importantes como a taxonomia, os padrões contábeis, nós precisamos sim do Brasil lá, mas a gente precisa também da conciliação disso com o problema de hoje e o problema do amanhã. Como resolver esse quebra-cabeça? Essa é a minha provocação para vocês. Porque, no fim do dia, os estados são representados por os, né, políticos que tomam as decisões, que fazem a nossa legislação e que fazem as escolhas sobre como o país vai operar. E todas essas questões têm que ser consideradas ao mesmo tempo. Então, acho que essa é a minha provocação para vocês. Fora isso, eu só queria comentar aqui, em relação aos estándares e o que a indústria financeira espera de ter um único número, eu fico feliz que a gente hoje está entendendo que conceitos que eu ouvi, que eu aprendi há 15 anos atrás sobre a necessidade da gente ter um triple bottom line, estão ganhando a devida atenção, só que a gente não tem outros 15 anos para definir tudo isso. Então, a minha provocação é como a gente chega rápido num consenso, porque, assim, a indústria financeira trabalha com estándares mundiais, né, aceitos mundialmente, para se avaliar a performance financeira. E como que a gente chega rapidamente em padrões que permitam à indústria financeira fazer o seu papel de gatekeeper e fazer o seu papel de intervir em favor da natureza, mas com estándares que sejam aceitos não só por um continente, mas que sejam aceitos globalmente, considerando que o mercado financeiro é um mercado global também.
Muito obrigado. E acho que só para contextualizar com mais contundência, Fabiana, o que você está trazendo, eu diria que as questões relacionadas à natureza não são mais de médio e longo prazo. Na semana passada, a gente viu nos noticiários uma fábrica inteira de uma indústria farmacêutica ser destruída por um tufão no Texas. A fábrica inteira. Não mais do que 6 meses atrás, nós soubemos que a seca extrema na Índia acabou com a produção de grãos. E que a enchente que aconteceu no Paquistão meses antes vai demorar 2 anos para o Paquistão se recuperar. E um detalhe importante, as crianças estão sem salas de aula, tendo aulas em tendas até hoje. Então, eu diria que hoje em dia não tem mais médio e longo prazo, é tudo curto prazo. Então, talvez a pergunta seja como é que a gente faz tudo junto ao mesmo tempo agora. E aí eu convido tanto o Tony quanto o Simon para falar um pouco sobre como eles estão percebendo essa demanda de urgência num assunto que ainda não está urgente na cabeça do setor.
I'll try to take that on first. Great question, Fabiana. And look, I think what you're alluding to is the central need for trade-offs to be made. The trade-off between now and later. Putting food on the table now versus not cutting down the trees that might provide the food for today, but help to ensure the resilience of nature for the longer term. These are really difficult trade-offs. I think from our perspective as TNFD, as a corporate reporting framework, what we've said is that the social dimension and the nature dimension really can't be separated. And that's why it's so fundamental for business and finance to be engaging with their stakeholders on an ongoing basis. Quite often we think about stakeholder engagement as something that happens once, maybe at the beginning of a project, and then it stops. But what we've been very clear in our guidance, and what will be coming out in September, is that at the business nature interface, the engagement with society and social and stakeholders needs to be a constant activity. It's not something that just happens in a moment in time. And that's going to be a shift for many organizations. And it's not just indigenous communities, it's also local communities in urban environments who are also impacted as well. Nature is everywhere. Obviously, its dimensions are different depending on the on the context. But we've got to be thinking about the interface between business, nature, and society in a completely different way. So we're trying to do our part in providing guidance about what that looks like and how it can be done more effectively. But it is obviously going to be a shift. But that is a big source of transition risk for business and finance, is the social license to operate. And because communities depend on nature, there's an inherent social license to operate risk for every business or every financial institution. If you are contributing to lowering the resilience of nature, which is lowering the resilience of the local communities, then you are increasing your exposure to a potential transition risk from a community backlash, from regulation, from fines. It can manifest itself, as we're seeing, in a number of different ways. So that's why there needs to be this sort of ongoing vigilance and monitoring of the society-nature interface, because that in itself can be something that business and finance are contributing to, and a source of risk for the institution going forward.
Thanks very much, Marcelo. Thank you for the third difficult question. But they're all the right questions, yeah? So can I give just some examples, yeah? I'm not sure if I have any sort of grand theory. So, you know, part of the source of poverty, I'm not sure in Brazil, but in many other places in the world at the moment, is the rapidly increase in food prices. And that's partly caused by the war in Ukraine, and partly caused by the structure of commodity markets. And the Task Force on Nature Markets has, as well as dealing with sort of new markets like biodiversity credit markets, has tried to get its head around these much larger multi-trillion-dollar markets, which are nature markets as well. So last year, the major food traders in the world had the most profitable year that they have ever had in their history. At exactly the same time that food prices have escalated, food supplies have become constrained, and food poverty has increased dramatically. And so surely it doesn't take a genius to say there's something wrong with that picture. Yeah, we have to look at the largest nature market on the planet, which is the way we trade food. And we have to ask, is it regulated in the right way? Yeah, and the plain and simple answer is no. Not only are commodity regulators under no obligation to look at any nature or climate issues, my goodness, that's a long way away from the story. But they have, at the moment, no obligation to force transparency and traceability into food commodity markets. We don't even know what's being traded and from where, let alone what the effects are. But what we do know is that in the last 12 months, during an outbreak of a huge war that has impacted fertilizer and wheat and all these other sales, the 6 commodity traders that dominate that market have had the most profitable year in their existence. Yeah, so I would say, modestly, that's not okay. Yeah, let me then give a second example, which comes more directly to the financial community. So, nature crimes are not only a source of nature destruction, but a source of huge social conflict and associated impacts. And nature crimes, according to most estimates, are valued in the order of $280 billion a year. It's the third largest source of illicit financial flows on the planet. Yeah, it's actually a nature market. It's just illegal. Yeah, it's sort of a way of thinking about it. Yeah, everybody's trading just against the law. And so where does finance fit into that? Well, finance, good finance, I mean, isn't putting money into illegal activities directly, but it is funding a food industry that is benefiting from those nature crimes. It's benefiting from it by being able to acquire ecosystem services at cut price. You know, if I'm a Liberian palm oil operator and I'm buying palm oil from illegally deforested land in Liberia, that palm oil is cheaper than if it was operating on legally managed land, and whatever financial institution is funding that palm oil company is making better profits, risk adjusted, as a result. But that financial institution carries no liability for that crime, because they may have a credit problem just in case that Liberian palm oil company goes bankrupt. But actually, it won't go bankrupt because the Ministry of Environment in Liberia is really weak. So it's not really a problem. That has to change. And it can change. We can require financial institutions to demonstrate that there are no nature crimes in their financing value chain. And I would think that the best of financial institutions, such as your own, already do that without a statutory requirement, but it's something that should be imposed, quite frankly, across the financial community. And that means it would squeeze the economic oxygen out of many of those nature crimes, with associated social benefits by reducing that criminal activity. So I think there are perhaps opportunities that we don't always think about. Well, one has to think transversely of what the different parts of this nature market architecture really looks like. And clearly, the nature crime piece can be and has to be resolved at the ground level, as we've seen action extensively in Brazil over the last 6 months. But it can also be addressed down financing value chains, and the financial community in that way can make a major contribution. Thank you.
Obrigado, Simon. Nós temos mais de 100 pessoas acompanhando nossa programação aqui hoje. Eu queria pegar uma pergunta que tem relação com o que você colocou, Simon, e direcioná-la para você, Tony. A Tatiana Midori, que é aqui da Itaúsa, ela pergunta sobre esse custo de ser pioneiro ou o custo de você estar à frente da regulação. Hoje, se o Brasil e outros países ricos em natureza tomarem essa liderança, a pergunta que ela faz é: isso poderia colocar o Brasil e outros países ricos em natureza numa posição mais vulnerável em relação a outros países, uma vez que através de um disclosure de seus dados de natureza, ele vai fazer um disclosure das suas potências e oportunidades, mas também vão aparecer os dados sobre desmatamento e outros desafios. Na TNFD, como é que vocês pensaram um pouco sobre esse protagonismo da liderança versus o custo desse protagonismo?
It's a very good question to which there's no easy answer. I do think if we recognize nature risk as a source of risk to business and finance, then you should be acting on that risk out of your own enlightened self-interest. Back to my analogy with cyber risk. This ultimately is about the resilience of nature and the resilience of business and finance. And the resilience of business and finance is dependent on the resilience of nature. So if you have a vulnerability, if you recognize that as a source of risk, you should act on it. Now, of course, it's easier if everyone does this all at the same time together. Everyone wants to stay in the pack, so to speak. But I think and with the release of the TNFD recommendations, we would expect more investors to be asking more questions of their companies they're invested in, and that's going to push up the demand for TNFD type disclosures. we're already hearing this happening in the market today. I was in Australia 6 months ago. One of the leading banks in Australia said that at their last annual general meeting last year, they had 4 questions from the floor on nature and biodiversity issues. We know that big institutional investors, BlackRock, Aviva, NBIM, the Norwegian sovereign fund, they now have nature in their stewardship guidelines, which is a clear signal that they will be asking more questions. We know that central banks are now starting to pay attention to nature risk. The network of the world's central banks has published a paper saying nature risk is alongside climate risk as a source of systemic risk to financial systems and to economies. So I think quite rapidly, we are going to see more institutional investors and more regulators asking more questions, and this will create more of a level playing field. But equally, we are hearing from companies that have pilot tested the TNFD framework saying we're going to be the first in our sector, because we think by acting on these risks and demonstrating that to investors, we can distinguish ourselves, and we can see this as a form of competitive advantage within our sector. So I think it can work both ways, to be honest. Of course, there's a risk in stepping forward and publishing more information than your competitors, maybe getting marked down as a result of that. And we've certainly seen that with climate reporting. But we're also hearing from companies saying, we think this is a source of competitive advantage. And particularly as they look to capitalize on the opportunity side of the equation, you know, how do we find the new business models? How do we find the new opportunities? Those who are moving early are the ones who are seeing this not just as a compliance exercise, but they're seeing this potentially as a new source of growth and opportunity and attracting new capital into their business by moving early. So I think it can work both directions.
Ótimo. Eu entendo que a gente tem uma pergunta aqui da audiência. Eu ia pedir só se, por favor, pudesse identificar, para a gente saber de onde você é, e agradeço a presença.
Ok, bom dia a todos e a todas. Eu sou Cristi Bechara, da Companhia Sustentável, e é um prazer estar aqui com vocês, muito aprendizado já. E eu trabalho há muitos anos com sustentabilidade, são 20 anos numa trajetória. Eu passei por multinacionais e hoje eu sou uma especialista em atender empresas do segmento B2B. Então, eu posso dizer que eu conheço relativamente sobre cadeia de suprimentos, cadeia de valor. E uma das necessidades que eu vejo fortemente entre, eu poderia dizer, apoio financeiro e apoio dos demais elos da cadeia de valor, é que eles têm interesse em aprofundar em pesquisa, desenvolvimento e inovação. E o Simon trouxe a abordagem dos estudos, falou do óleo de palma. Então, nós temos muito gargalos no Brasil, considerando todo o potencial de desenvolvimento de novas patentes e soluções na Amazônia. Então, dado esse contexto, gostaria de trazer uma provocação a vocês, uma pergunta. Cadeia de suprimentos, PDI, é um caminho para a gente encontrar essas métricas e desenvolver melhor soluções para a natureza? Obrigada.
Muito obrigado, viu? Simon, podemos começar com você?
And the question is the supply chain the most effective ways in which to retrieve data or in which to drive business innovation? I would perhaps like...
I think it's research, development, and innovation.
Right. So clearly, businesses are reconfiguring their supply chains to take account of the way in which nature-related risk and opportunities are being factored into business decisions, policies and regulations and so on. If you go back 20 years to when we had the first generation of sweatshop problems, we had a brink here and we had internationally increasingly large brands like Nike and others beginning to reconfigure the way in which their supply chains worked to take account of the range of reasons, moral or business or regulatory reasons, for taking worker rights and standards into account. Yeah, so, so part of the answer is yes. The interesting question becomes how and to what effect. So again, let me, since you provoke us, I'll provoke you back. Let's take an example. Suppose, we begin to see nature-related risk integrated into financing decisions of business processes and significantly increasing the cost of Brazilian food exports, which is a very possible thing to happen. And coming back to the earlier question that Tony answered, could offer an upside competitive advantage if you can move away from commodity soya to a branded soya, for example. You've suddenly got a wonderful soya that's terribly regenerative and sustainable, if you can really get a premium in the market, or places you at a disadvantage because the Chinese won't pay more for sustainable soya and they take 60% of your product. So that's the dilemma we're facing. But what happens if actually the R&D and innovation in that space isn't only about how to improve production processes in Brazil, but is also how to produce at least some food products, perhaps not soya, in different ways. Suppose it makes it more attractive for Chinese buyers to think about onshoring soya production into China and using far more capital-intensive mechanisms instead of the more extensive approaches that are being used from their purchasers across Latin America. And so I think it's quite unknown or hard to predict at this point as to whether the R&D research development effects of beginning to take nature into account leads to A, a whole bunch of people going out of business, B, a whole bunch of people developing nature-rich branded products that can secure a premium in some markets, or C, leads to technological innovations that actually move production systems away from where they originally were to perhaps a completely different place. So yes, technological innovation and other innovations will happen up and down supply chains as nature and indeed climate becomes increasingly countered. But actually what that means for any particular producer, any particular product, or any particular country remains, I think, a very open question at this stage. Thanks.
E eu diria que tem ponto importante para a gente lembrar aí, que no caso do Brasil, isso se relaciona, seja com, por exemplo, a gente diferenciar e ampliar o uso de outras matrizes genéticas florestais. Hoje a indústria brasileira é muito focada no eucalipto, e a gente tem inúmeras espécies brasileiras que poderiam ser muito interessantes para várias aplicações, mas falta justamente conhecimento de pesquisa e desenvolvimento para fazer isso. Por outro lado, se a gente não ficar atento à rapidez como esse processo está se desenvolvendo, nós veremos outras vias de produção de alimentos, por exemplo, como a gente está vendo produção de proteínas com fermentação ou outras técnicas que não vão mais exigir uso do solo. E isso tem uma vantagem de um lado, porque você vai usar o solo para outras coisas, mas existe uma mudança econômica, de produção econômica, que o Brasil também teria que estar atento e investindo nesse tipo de abordagem. Com isso, eu vou aproveitar aqui para fazer, Tony, uma pergunta para você que veio online da Bruna Martins, de Campos, da Banrisul, onde ela pergunta se, ao colhermos dados sobre natureza, identificarmos oportunidades, se existe sinergia disso, na pergunta dela, com outras questões relacionadas, por exemplo, a contribuir para a saúde, segurança alimentar, nutricional da população. Ou seja, até que ponto essa informação não é apenas uma informação para o investimento em natureza, mas também tem efeitos secundários positivos em outras áreas, como nutricional e saúde. Vocês olharam isso no TNFD?
I think it definitely could, and we should be thinking about the data that's getting collected and the multiple uses that it could serve, just from an efficiency point of view. So I think, again, it will depend on the sector and the particular business or context, but I would imagine that some of the data that we are suggesting that should be collected could also inform other decisions around health and nutrition and things like that as well. So it comes back to a point I made earlier, that the place to start is, what data do we have now within our organization? Because what we've heard from the pilot testing is some organizations that have tried to do a pilot test of the TNFD approach discovered data that they already had in their organization that the team doing the TNFD pilot was not initially aware of. So the first question is really, let's start with what we already have, then we should go and find additional data. And then I think, to the question, the data and analytics we assemble might then inform a whole range of decisions, not just around nature-related risk.
Perfeito. Bom, a gente está chegando agora no final. Eu entendo que tem comentário aqui no fundo da sala. Depois eu vou passar para suas conclusões finais aqui na frente. Por favor.
Obrigada, Marcelo. Sou eu de novo. Não posso deixar de falar. Bom, primeiro, eu acho que eu não respondi diretamente a sua pergunta, como o agribusiness vê a natureza. Eu acho que o empresário, o produtor da cadeia do agronegócio vê a natureza como um ativo, assim como o Brasil vê a natureza como um ativo, e eu embarquei na visão do Brasil, mas respondendo diretamente a sua pergunta. Então, eu acho que, em sendo um ativo, conectando com a ideia de que a gente precisa colocar tudo isso dentro do balance sheet, dentro dos padrões de contabilidade, etc. Eu acho que essa parte é a parte fácil. Existe uma consciência de que o agronegócio é totalmente dependente das questões da natureza. Porém, conectando isso com a observação do Sami a respeito da lucratividade dos grandes conglomerados, das trading companies do mundo, ser o mais alto historicamente, quando a pobreza no mundo talvez tenha atingido também níveis, aí o custo dos alimentos, níveis altíssimos. É muito interessante esse comentário, porque quando nós, enquanto bancos, que sim, já estamos sendo cobrados pelos reguladores, eu estou tendo auditoria sobre o impacto climático no meu portfólio, começando nesta semana pelo Banco Central Brasileiro, mas quando os reguladores, quando os bancos questionam as trading companies, por exemplo, sobre por que não temos mercado, por que não temos mais pagamento de prêmio por produtos que tenham diferenciação, eles nos respondem, porque não tem demanda. Então, a percepção do agronegócio, e aqui eu estou relatando a percepção, não estou colocando a minha visão, é de que as mesmas sociedades que estão cobrando uma visão diferente e uma ação diferente a respeito da natureza e do agronegócio brasileiro não estão dispostas a pagar por isso. E aí fica a questão, who is gonna pay the bill?
Eu vou deixar isso para eles falarem nas suas considerações finais, tá? Que é o que a gente vai fazer agora. Mas só antes de passar a palavra para vocês fazerem suas considerações finais, eu queria só comentar com quem está aqui, quem está online, que a ideia de diálogos como esse é uma ideia que, como uma contribuição da Itaúsa para a gente fortalecer e fomentar o campo, nós queremos fazer mais vezes. Então, eu queria primeiro sinalizar para vocês que podem esperar mais eventos como esse na Itaúsa, conversando com as nossas investidas, com o campo, com a sociedade brasileira. A ideia nós entendemos que essa transformação e oportunidade que existe no Brasil só vai ser realizada se nós fizermos alguma coisa sobre isso. Então, não basta a gente ficar falando, alguém deveria fazer alguma coisa sobre isso. A pergunta que nós estamos colocando é o que nós podemos fazer sobre isso. E existe o interesse, ao ser um colaborador, um agente dessa transformação que o Brasil pode ser uma sociedade melhor, um país melhor, e uma economia alinhada com o futuro, que é se alinhar com o desafio do clima, da natureza e da equidade, de fazer não só os debates, mas a implementação dessa ação. Então, a minha expectativa, Tony, é que a gente saia daqui com mais empresas e organizações querendo prototipar TNFD. A minha expectativa, Simon, é que vão haver mais organizações interessadas nas recomendações que a Força-Tarefa vai divulgar no dia 10 de agosto. Essas recomendações são o começo de uma conversa, porque recomendação e ficar bonitinha na prateleira e num artigo de jornal, eu tenho certeza não é o que nós estamos interessados em recomendações que possam entrar na pauta do G20, entrar na pauta da COP30 e fazer a verdadeira transformação. Então, com isso, eu queria convidar, por favor, Simon e depois Tony, para as suas considerações finais, e aí a gente tem um rápido vídeo de 30 segundos com um convite para todos vocês. Simon.
Thank you, Marcelo. So I will start by just repeating our thanks to Itaúsa, to yourself, and other members of the Itaúsa team for this session. Actually, if a lot of other people simply listened to a video of this conversation, with the questions that you've asked and the conversations we've had, it would be a very rich communication to influence other people's thinking. So I think this conversation has not touched on everything, but it's touched on absolutely critical pieces of this agenda. And so I thank you all very much for your thoughts and reflections. My brief closing reflections, actually, I'll start by sort of crossing the floor, which is Nature Finance are huge supporters of the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, TNFD, that Tony runs. And we're very pleased to have been involved from the beginning in finding ways to help TNFD move quickly and ambitiously towards a framework that can make a difference. And so I think my first reflection, perhaps saving you saying the same thing, Tony, you can say something else, is TNFD is not the silver bullet, but is like a foundation. Without getting those metrics and assessments and risk analysis, asset reevaluation, communication correct, it's very hard to do the other stuff, all of the fancy innovation and the policy and the standards and the technology development and all the stuff we've talked about. How do you do that without the basics? Well, the answer is you don't. So think of TNFD as sort of table stakes. That it needs to be done for itself, but it also needs to be done because of all the layers that we can begin to build on top of that common language about the way the nature economy interface actually works. That's why it's so important, not only for you to use it, but for it to become a common currency across the global business community. So that would be my first observation or conclusion. I think my second conclusion, perhaps reflecting, Fabienne, your last remark, who the hell's going to pay for this, if I can paraphrase you, is I don't think it can be paid for through commodity markets. It can only be paid for through branded markets. That in order for a country like Brazil to develop a vibrant nature economy that is outward looking and is exporting nature positive products and services, that is effectively a branded proposition, not a commodity proposition. That it has to be part of what creates an overarching premium in what goes into markets, but for that, many markets internationally have to change, not only things that have to happen here. So I don't believe you're going to sell nature positive soya in today's food commodity markets. It's just not going to work, right? Something has to change at a bigger level. And so that really brings me to the third point, which we've now heard from pretty much everybody that said anything here today, which is one has to change the rules of the game. Ricardo started that right at the beginning this morning. And yes, the rules of the game, partly risk and disclosure and so on and so forth, but there's a bigger set of rules in the game. And Brazil, without doubt, has a unique opportunity to do that. Very briefly, in 2015-16, I was based in China working with financial regulators on how you bring environment into the way financial markets work. And China, to its credit, decided to take the green finance agenda to the G20 under its presidency in 2015-16, and it created ripples across the entire of the G20 community in terms of the way green finance is regulated, overseen, the way central banks and others begin to function, not only individual market actors. Brazil can do that for the nature economy. And if it doesn't, it will suffer. Because if it doesn't, to your point, nobody will pay because the rules of the road will not require them to pay, and you'll be at a competitive disadvantage instead of a competitive advantage. So if you want to protect nature and build a productive, creative, and more equal nature economy, you have to address the broader rules of the game that operate in international markets. And that's possible for you to do in a way that almost no other country on the planet can do. Thank you.
Tony, concluding remarks, please.
I might take you back to 2 conversations that I was part of at COP26 last year in Egypt. The first was a presentation we were doing on TNFD and nature with the WWF. And we had 4 of the world's stock exchanges on a panel together. And the woman from the New York Stock Exchange said that the train has left the station on nature-related corporate reporting and disclosure. Consumer preferences are changing. Regulators have now acknowledged nature as a source of systemic risk, and investors are asking more questions. So from a compliance perspective, if that's the mindset that you take, the train has left the station. So you have every incentive to be paying attention to TNFD, pick up our recommendations in September, and start looking at the implications of those for your organization. And that's why 200 organizations have already piloted the framework, because they want to be ahead. They don't want to be behind their industry peers. So that's the first sort of anecdote that I would pass on from my experience in Egypt last year. The second was a different event that I was at, and a woman who works for a private equity firm in South Africa told a story of a strategy day that they had as a leadership team. They went off-site, they spent the whole day talking about the future of the business, and to my surprise, she said that they spent 4 hours of their off-site doing a desktop exercise using some of our advice, the LEAP approach to how do we identify and assess our nature-related issues. So I was amazed that the leadership team would choose to spend half of their whole strategy day looking at nature-related issues and using the TNFD's draft advice. And she said the conclusion after 4 hours, she said it was like a wow moment for their leadership team. That's how she described it. It was a wow moment. Because for them, going through this desktop exercise together over 4 or 5 hours was like a light bulb that went off about all of the new areas of nature-related opportunity that they as a private equity business should be looking at as growth opportunities for their business as a private equity firm in Southern Africa. So she almost brushed aside the risk management aspect, saying, yes, of course we have to look at this from a risk management perspective, but the key takeaway for them was all about the opportunity side of the equation. So you can take a compliance mindset to things like nature-related reporting. But as I said before, I think the real opportunity in Brazil, following Simon's comments, is for Brazil to try and be proactive, to walk towards this problem, not walk away from this problem, walk towards the challenge, embrace it, and lead in terms of finding the solutions, finding the scalable business models, and finding the scalable financing solutions that the rest of the world is desperately looking for and can then replicate. And I think to the question of who pays, from a risk management perspective, of course, there needs to be some investment by companies to improve their own risk management, just as you have with cybersecurity. If you accept that it's a central risk issue that needs to be managed by the organization in the best interests and the fiduciary duty that you have to your shareholders, then you need to appropriately invest in risk management. But beyond that, I think we need to fully mobilize the finance sector's capabilities. We need to bring in government, and I think there's opportunities for governments to be paying for environmental and ecosystem outcomes. There's been a lot of conversation about that for many years, but I think we finally have to figure out the models to enable that to happen. Much as governments have been quite happy paying for productivity outcomes by financing infrastructure projects. You know, when a government funds a toll road project, what are they paying for? They're paying for a productivity uplift in the economy, because that's what a toll road will deliver, moving people, moving goods faster around an economy. And there's very little debate about that having social benefits and having economic benefits. If we start thinking about nature as infrastructure and investing in nature like we do with traditional infrastructure, then governments should be willing to pay for those outcomes. And that commitment and the ability and willingness to do that will unlock new financial structures, which can then take some of the solutions to scale. So I think it definitely has to involve public sector, private sector, finance sector working together in order to both manage the risks and unlock these new opportunities.
Muito obrigado, Tony. E se o Joaquim Levy estivesse aqui, ele ia pegar o microfone agora e falar, e não se esqueçam que o consumidor e a sociedade como um todo tem que participar disso. Porque sem a pressão e o engajamento dos consumidores e da sociedade, a gente não consegue fazer essa bola rodar. Queria agradecer muito a presença de todos e todas aqui e lembrar que isso que pareceu uma coisa simplória, põe 100 pessoas aí online, faz tradução simultânea, entra aqui no prédio sem ter que mostrar a sua identidade. Não acontece assim magicamente. Tem muita gente que trabalhou por trás de realizar esse evento. Eu queria, em nome do Raimundo Guimarães, que trabalha, ele devia estar aqui na sala, talvez esteja lá dentro, queria agradecer todos aqueles da área de comunicação, da área de apoio de logística, pelo esforço, porque isso é um esforço comum. Na Itaúsa, a gente está trabalhando a agenda de ESG, compartilhando a jornada, seja com a Priscila, que é a nossa CFO, Maria Fernanda, que é a nossa diretora jurídica, o Fred, que é o nosso diretor para novos negócios e monitoramento de portfólio. Então, o Alfredo sabe que ele está, e o Ricardo, em muito boas mãos, porque a gente não só entende que o jeito de fazer isso é juntos, mas a gente está gostando de fazer isso junto. Eu acho que isso muda a equação, porque ao invés de ser algo que você tem que colocar e ensinar a sua organização, é algo que as pessoas estão naturalmente dizendo, eu estou curtindo fazer parte disso. E esse Brasil cheio de oportunidades só vai conseguir realizar se nós sairmos dessa sala querendo fazer isso. Então, espero que vocês tenham percebido que os eventos que a gente quer fazer aqui não são meros eventos, porque evento acaba e não acontece nada com isso. A gente espera ter deixado uma semente para vocês, uma provocação, um engajamento, e a gente espera que não tenha sido blá blá. Alguma coisa que vocês já ouviram antes e que foi mais uma vez um discurso bonito. Eu acho que a gente quis trazer provocação, novidade, inquietação e escuta. Simon e Tony estão saindo daqui com aprendizado também. Isso era importante e um dos nossos objetivos. Muito obrigado. Por favor, Aproveita, a gente tem uns minutos aqui fora com café e suco para vocês falarem diretamente com eles. E aqueles que quiserem retornar à casa, ela vai estar aberta. Aqueles que quiserem contar para os amigos que não estiveram online ou aqui, que perderam uma grande oportunidade, façam isso, porque os nossos eventos são eventos para fazer um Brasil melhor. Obrigado. E agora vai ter o vídeo surpresa que eu falei para vocês.
Olá, amigas e amigos, saudações. Eu sou Marcelo Brito, estou secretário executivo do Consórcio Amazônia Legal, parceiro da Nature Finance, da Concertação pela Amazônia e do BID, no evento Inovação, Finanças e Natureza, que ocorrerá em Belém, agora no próximo dia 10, na Estação das Docas. E lá pretendemos discutir novos modelos de financiamento da Amazônia, novos modelos de engajamento do setor privado, relações comerciais, relações políticas, transacionais, ou seja, que agenda é essa nova do Brasil, que conecta os estados amazônicos, conecta a Amazônia ao Brasil e, consequentemente, o Brasil ao mundo. São todos bem-vindos a Belém, espero vê-los. Um grande abraço.
Então fica o convite, vai ser transmitido online, dia 10 de agosto, um dia inteiro de discussão com as mentes mais interessantes do Brasil e do mundo lá conosco. Muito obrigado.